When the guards failed to return and the hours passed without orders, without punishment, and without any sign that authority still existed, the prisoners began to realize that the silence surrounding the camp was not a delay or a mistake, but something far more unsettling, because waiting for control to come back felt safer than discovering what it meant to exist without it. Morning arrived quietly, without the familiar sounds that usually signaled the beginning of the day, and the men became aware of it not because something happened, but because nothing did. There was no whistle cutting through the air, no shouted commands echoing across the yard, and no heavy boots striking the ground in practiced rhythm. Yet the prisoners woke almost at the same time, their bodies responding out of habit rather than instruction, moving before their minds had time to question why. They sat up on their bunks in the dim light, listening carefully, expecting the camp to announce itself as it always had, through creaking doors, clearing throats, and the metallic clatter of equipment. But the silence remained intact, heavy and unfamiliar, settling into the space where routine usually lived. No one spoke, not because speaking was forbidden, but because each man sensed that words might disturb something fragile and unresolved. When they stepped outside, the yard looked unchanged at first glance, yet subtly wrong, as if an essential layer had been removed overnight. The ground was undisturbed, the mud smooth where no patrol had crossed it, and the watchtowers stood empty, their ladders unused and their windows dark, giving the unsettling impression that the camp itself had fallen asleep and forgotten to wake. Still, the routines continued. Blankets were folded with the same careful precision learned through months of repetition. Boots were laced tightly, even though no inspection awaited them, and jackets were buttoned out of reflex rather than necessity. Hands moved automatically, guided by memory instead of command, repeating motions that no longer served an obvious purpose, yet abandoning them felt unthinkable. Without a word exchanged, the men drifted into the yard and arranged themselves as they always had, maintaining familiar distances between one another, aligning their bodies as if invisible lines still existed beneath their feet. A few glanced toward the gate, noticing that it stood slightly open, not wide enough to invite escape, but open enough to be seen, and those glances were quickly withdrawn, as though acknowledging the opening might trigger consequences that no longer came. No guard shouted for them to step back. No rifle was raised. No voice corrected their hesitation. The absence of reaction created a tension far sharper than discipline ever had, because nothing defined what would happen next. Time stretched unevenly, no longer divided by orders or schedules, and the men found themselves standing in place, unsure whether waiting was still expected or whether waiting itself had become a choice. A man shifted his weight cautiously, testing the ground beneath his boots, not because it was unstable, but because certainty had vanished. Another cleared his throat quietly, then lowered his head again, as if sound itself might draw attention that no longer existed. Slowly, an unsettling realization began to take shape, not spoken aloud, but shared through posture and stillness. Nothing was stopping them. There were no immediate consequences for standing still, and none for moving, yet neither option felt safe. The rules that once structured their days had not been removed violently or dramatically. They had simply dissolved, leaving behind an emptiness the men did not know how to navigate. They had learned how to survive within strict limits, how to endure punishment, and how to obey in order to remain alive, but no one had taught them how to exist when control disappeared without explanation. And so they remained where they were, not restrained by force, but held in place by uncertainty, waiting for order to return, even as the camp stood silent around them, offering no guidance, no threat, and no relief. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the morning stretched into something that no longer felt like morning at all, the men began to sense that the silence surrounding them was not temporary, and that whatever had changed was not about to correct itself. Time no longer moved forward with purpose, and without orders to follow or tasks to complete, the hours seemed to loosen their shape, expanding and contracting unpredictably, leaving the men unsure how much of the day had passed or what was expected of them next. Waiting, which had once been enforced by authority, now continued without instruction, and this subtle difference carried a weight the men struggled to define. They found themselves remaining in place long after there was no reason to do so, not because they were afraid to move, but because movement felt unjustified without permission. Standing still required no explanation, while acting demanded a reason they no longer possessed. Some men drifted toward familiar spots in the yard, drawn by habit rather than intention, positioning themselves where they had stood on countless previous days, as if the ground itself might still remember the rules. Others lingered near the barracks, sitting on benches or low steps, watching the open space ahead with quiet attention, as though something might eventually emerge to clarify the situation. No one suggested leaving. The open gate remained visible at the edge of the camp, unchanged and unattended, yet it did not feel like an invitation. It felt like an unanswered question, and unanswered questions carried risk. Approaching it meant acknowledging that the next step would belong entirely to the one who took it, without the protection of orders or shared responsibility. As the hours passed, the men became increasingly aware of an unfamiliar pressure building beneath the surface of their calm exterior. Under captivity, obedience had been simple, because the reason for obedience existed outside the self. Now, every choice demanded internal justification, and that demand exposed a vulnerability they had not prepared for. A few men tested the silence carefully, altering small behaviors rather than making obvious moves. One delayed joining the others, remaining alone a moment longer than usual, listening for a reaction that never came. Another skipped a routine task entirely, waiting for correction that did not arrive. Each experiment confirmed the same unsettling truth that nothing external responded to their actions anymore. Instead of relief, these confirmations brought unease. Without punishment to fear, the men lacked a clear measure of safety. The absence of consequences did not create freedom. It created ambiguity, and ambiguity required judgment. Judgment demanded confidence, and confidence had been eroded by years of survival through compliance. Conversation remained sparse and cautious. When men spoke, their words circled around practical observations rather than intentions, avoiding questions about the future or speculation about what the silence meant. Plans were mentioned without detail, ideas raised, and then quietly abandoned, as if committing to a thought might bind them to a decision they were not ready to make. Gradually, waiting transformed from a passive condition into an active choice, though few recognized it as such. Each moment spent standing, sitting, or pacing familiar paths reinforced the idea that remaining within known boundaries was safer than confronting the uncertainty beyond them. The camp, unchanged in structure, offered psychological shelter simply by being familiar. As evening approached without announcement, the men returned to their barracks almost automatically, guided not by instruction, but by the comfort of routine. No one ordered them inside, yet they went, lying down at the same hours as before, surrendering to sleep not because they were exhausted, but because sleep postponed the need to decide what to do next. By the end of the day, it had become clear that the guards did not need to return for control to persist. Waiting itself had taken their place, filling the space where authority once stood, holding the men in suspension through hesitation rather than force. And as night settled over the camp, quiet and undisturbed, the men drifted into rest with an uneasy understanding that the hardest part of the silence was not what it allowed them to do, but what it demanded they decide on their own. As the second day passed without interruption, the men began to understand that the silence surrounding them was no longer something external, but something that had entered their thoughts and begun shaping their behavior from within. What had first felt like an absence now felt like a presence, quiet but attentive, as though the camp itself were observing them without eyes or voice. They became increasingly aware of their own movements, not because anyone corrected them, but because the lack of correction made every action feel exposed. A step taken too quickly, a pause that lingered too long, a glance toward the gate that lasted a moment beyond comfort. Each of these gestures seemed to carry weight, even though no rule defined why. The men did not fear punishment, yet they sensed that standing out carried a cost they could not name. Gradually, self-monitoring replaced obedience. Men adjusted their posture unconsciously, aligning themselves with what felt appropriate rather than what was required. Voices lowered, not out of discipline, but out of instinct, as if loud sound might fracture the fragile balance that had settled over the camp. Movements slowed and became more deliberate, shaped by the awareness that every choice now belonged entirely to the one making it. This inward focus did not bring clarity. Instead, it narrowed attention, reducing the world to manageable patterns. Familiar routines were repeated, not because they were enforced, but because repetition reduced uncertainty. Doing what had always been done required no explanation, while doing something new demanded justification that felt risky and unnecessary. The men began watching one another more closely, though never openly. A man who moved too freely drew subtle attention, not in the form of words, but through pauses in conversation or brief, unreadable looks. Someone who deviated from the shared rhythm sensed it immediately, even without comment, and often corrected himself before the deviation became noticeable. In this way, behavior aligned quietly, guided by mutual awareness rather than authority. The camp grew calmer as this adjustment took hold. There were fewer moments of hesitation, fewer visible signs of confusion. Days passed smoothly, ordered not by commands, but by shared expectation. The men did not need to discuss what was acceptable. They felt it, sensed it, and responded accordingly. Stability returned, though its source was no longer external. What made this shift particularly unsettling was how natural it felt. The men did not experience themselves as restrained. They experienced themselves as careful, considerate, cooperative. Yet beneath this cooperation lay a quiet surrender of initiative, a gradual withdrawal from the responsibility of choosing freely. Freedom demanded effort, attention, and risk, while conformity offered ease and predictability. As this internal discipline strengthened, the idea of acting independently began to feel unnecessary, even disruptive. The silence that once provoked anxiety now provided structure. It filled the space once occupied by orders, shaping behavior without resistance. By the end of this phase, the men were no longer waiting for the guards to return. They were waiting for nothing at all, sustained by routines that now existed for their own sake. Control had not vanished with the absence of authority. It had simply changed location, moving inward and outward at the same time, residing in thought, habit, and the quiet awareness of being seen by one another. The silence, once empty, had learned how to watch. As the silence continued without interruption, the men began to sense that something new had taken shape around them, not announced and not imposed, but present nonetheless. What had started as individual caution gradually extended outward, linking their behavior together into a pattern that felt shared, understood, and increasingly difficult to resist. Without realizing when the change occurred, they were no longer responding only to their own uncertainty, but to the expectations forming quietly between them. Observation moved beyond the self. Men began noticing who stood where, who arrived early, who lingered too long near the edges of the yard, and who remained within the familiar center of activity. These observations were rarely acknowledged, yet they influenced behavior all the same. A pause in conversation, a brief look held a moment too long, or the sudden stillness of a nearby group communicated more than any spoken rule ever could. Correction no longer required instruction. When someone disrupted the emerging rhythm, even unintentionally, the discomfort that followed was immediate and unmistakable. The response was subtle, never confrontational, but effective. Most men adjusted quickly, not because they feared punishment, but because the imbalance felt wrong, as if it threatened the fragile stability they had begun to rely on. Over time, shared routines solidified, standing at certain hours, gathering in familiar places, lowering voices during long stretches of the day, all continued without discussion. These behaviors persisted not because they were enforced, but because they were mirrored. Each man reinforced the pattern simply by participating in it, and the pattern, in turn, reduced the burden of uncertainty for everyone involved. The camp appeared calm again. From a distance, it might have looked orderly, even peaceful, as if discipline had returned in a gentler form. Yet this calm was not the result of safety or resolution. It was the result of alignment. The men had learned how to move together without direction, how to regulate themselves by sensing the group rather than consulting authority. In this environment, individuality softened. Impulses that once pushed men toward the gate or toward questioning the silence gradually faded. Curiosity diminished, replaced by the quiet reassurance that came from blending into the shared rhythm. Acting alone required effort and carried emotional cost, while conformity offered ease and acceptance. What made this transformation especially powerful was how reasonable it felt. No one was forced to comply. No one was threatened. Yet the collective behavior shaped choices more effectively than any guard ever had. Responsibility for maintaining order was no longer external. It belonged to everyone and to no one at the same time, diffused across the group until its source became impossible to identify. By the end of this phase, the men were no longer constrained by fear of authority or hope of release. They were constrained by the stability they had created together, a stability that depended on continued participation. The camp no longer needed commands to function, because command had dissolved into expectation. Control had returned, not with noise or force, but with silence and agreement, surrounding the men with boundaries that felt invisible, logical, and increasingly difficult to cross. As the quiet order they had built together continued to hold, the men began to notice that life inside the camp no longer felt strained or uncertain, but smooth in a way that was difficult to question. Days unfolded with familiar rhythm, shaped by routines that no longer needed reinforcement, and the absence of disruption brought a sense of calm that felt earned rather than imposed. What had once been enforced discipline had transformed into something gentler and far more persuasive. The men woke at similar hours each morning, not because they were required to, but because waking then felt natural. They moved through the yard along established paths, avoiding the edges without consciously deciding to do so, drawn instead toward the center where others gathered and where behavior felt predictable. Meals, conversations, and periods of rest followed patterns that required little thought, and in this predictability, the men found relief. Relief mattered more than freedom. Freedom, as it now presented itself, felt undefined and demanding. It offered no structure, no shared understanding, and no clear reassurance that leaving would lead to something better. Outside the camp, choices would have to be made alone, without the quiet support of collective rhythm. Inside, life asked less. It provided boundaries that reduced uncertainty and minimized the effort required to move through each day. Some men still approached the open areas of the camp, lingering near the boundaries where departure was possible. They stood there briefly, looking outward, measuring distance and possibility, yet each time they turned back. The decision did not feel dramatic. It felt practical. Leaving meant confronting questions they were not ready to answer, while staying meant continuing a life that, though narrow, felt manageable. The camp had become efficient again. There were fewer disagreements, fewer moments of visible confusion, fewer disruptions of any kind. The shared system they maintained worked because it simplified existence. It removed the need to decide constantly, to justify actions, or to imagine uncertain futures. The men no longer felt trapped, yet they did not feel free either. They felt contained, and containment had become comforting. What made this phase especially powerful was how little resistance it encountered. No one argued for leaving. No one demanded change. Not because those ideas were forbidden, but because they felt unnecessary. Stability had returned, and stability carried weight. The thought of disturbing it introduced discomfort, while preserving it promised ease. In this environment, postponement became routine, and routine slowly became identity. The men did not speak about staying as a choice. They experienced it as the default. Each day spent within the familiar patterns reinforced the next, until the idea of leaving seemed distant, abstract, and emotionally costly. The camp no longer represented captivity in the way it once had. It represented order, predictability, and the absence of risk. By the end of this phase, the truth was impossible to ignore. They were no longer held in place by fences, guards, or fear. They were held by a system they had built together, one that asked little of them beyond participation. Obedience had become voluntary. Routine had become refuge, and a quiet life inside the camp felt safer than the undefined freedom beyond it. Staying required no explanation. Leaving would require courage. And so the men remained, not because they were forced to, but because the world they knew, however limited, felt easier to inhabit than a freedom that offered no guidance, no structure, and no promise of comfort. In the end, the guards did not need to return for the camp to continue functioning, because their absence had already revealed something far more enduring than authority itself, something that remained quietly in place even when orders, punishment, and supervision disappeared. What had once been enforced from the outside had settled inward, shaping behavior through habit, expectation, and the shared need for predictability. The prisoners did not stay because they were forced to, but because leaving demanded a kind of certainty they no longer possessed. Freedom arrived without instruction, without reassurance, and without a clear path forward, while the routines of the camp, however restrictive, offered clarity and familiarity. In choosing what felt manageable, they avoided what felt undefined. Nothing dramatic marked this choice. There was no refusal, no declaration, no moment that could be pointed to as the instant freedom was rejected. There were only small delays, repeated often enough to feel natural, until waiting became routine and routine became comfort. The absence of control did not restore the men to themselves. It asked them to carry responsibility they had not practiced carrying. The gates could remain open, and the watchtowers could stay empty, because captivity no longer depended on walls or guards. It endured through familiarity, through the quiet agreement to preserve what felt stable, and through the human tendency to seek order even when that order limited possibility. And so the camp did not end with release or resistance, but with continuation, leaving behind a quiet reminder that the most powerful forms of control are not imposed through force, but sustained through habits that survive long after authority has vanished. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.